Creepy Vault Files presents 2 creepy paranormal activity incidents.
You know how it is when you hear a ghost story that just sounds too crazy to be true. That's exactly what I thought when my cousin Emma told me about the night she and her friends explored Blackwood Manor. The place had been abandoned for decades, and locals whispered about its dark past and Lord Blackwood's rumored occult practices. One stormy night, Emma and her friends decided to check it out. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper and cracked ceilings. Every creak and groan of the old house sent chills down their spines, but they pressed on, driven by curiosity and adrenaline. In the grand ballroom, they found a massive dusty chandelier swaying gently above them, despite the lack of any breeze. It seemed to be moving of its own accord, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The room was filled with antique furniture covered in white sheets, resembling ghostly figures in the dim light. As they explored further, the storm outside intensified, and the wind began to howl through the broken windows, creating an eerie symphony of sound. They reached the old library, where towering bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient leather-bound tomes. A large portrait of Lord Blackwood hung above the fireplace, his stern eyes seeming to follow them wherever they went. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights simultaneously. Panic set in as they were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside. Huddling together, they felt an icy presence closing in around them, tightening their breaths and freezing them in place. A faint whisper filled the air, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. It was a woman's voice, chanting in an unknown language, the words carrying a sinister, almost hypnotic tone. The temperature dropped further, and their breath became visible in the cold air. Emma's friend, Sarah, suddenly let out a gasp and clutched her chest, her eyes wide with terror. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Emma and the others tried to help her, but it was as if an invisible force was holding them back. The chanting grew louder, echoing through the room and reverberating in their ears. The figure of a tall, gaunt man emerged from the shadows, his hollow eyes and sinister grin sending a wave of pure terror through the group. He seemed to glide towards them, his movements slow and deliberate. The friends could feel his cold, malevolent presence pressing down on them, suffocating them with fear. Emma and her friends bolted from the room, leaving Sarah behind. They ran through the darkened halls, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls, but the house seemed to twist and turn around them, making it difficult to find their way out. They could still hear the chanting, now interspersed with Sarah's anguished cries, urging them to move faster. Finally, they burst through the front doors and into the stormy night, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. They ran to the nearest house, frantically pounding on the door and begging for help. When they returned to Blackwood Manor with a group of townsfolk, they found Sarah lying in the grand ballroom, seemingly unconscious. Relieved but wary, they carried her out of the house. She remained unresponsive, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow. They took her to the hospital, where doctors ran numerous tests, but found nothing physically wrong with her. She was discharged the next day, but something about her was different. In the days that followed, Sarah's behavior became increasingly strange. She would stare into space for hours, muttering to herself in a language no one could understand. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull and vacant. She seemed to be in a constant state of distress, plagued by nightmares and visions that left her screaming in the middle of the night. Till this day, Sarah still acts the same way, and my cousin Emma and her friends blame themselves for how she is, wondering if anything could be done to bring her back.
I never believed in the supernatural until I spent a night in Evergreen Cemetery. It was an experience that shattered my skepticism and left me with a lingering fear that I can't shake off. It all started with a dare. My friends and I had been sharing ghost stories around a campfire, the kind of stories that were meant to spook each other out but were never taken seriously. Someone mentioned Evergreen Cemetery, notorious for its strange occurrences and ghostly sightings. Jenna, always the fearless one, suggested we spend a night there. The challenge was to stay from midnight until dawn. We gathered our gear, flashlights, a voice recorder, a camera, and enough bravado to get us through the night. By the time we arrived at Evergreen Cemetery, the full moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the tombstones. The gates, old and rusted, groaned as we pushed them open. The path leading into the cemetery was overgrown with weeds, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The cemetery was ancient, with graves dating back to the 1800s. Some of the tombstones were so worn that their inscriptions were barely legible. Statues of angels and weeping women stood silently, their stone faces appearing almost lifelike in the moonlight. The place had a palpable heaviness, a sense of sorrow that seemed to seep into your bones. We decided to set up our base near an old crypt in the centre of the cemetery. The crypt was massive, with heavy stone doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Jenna, the de facto leader of our little expedition, suggested we start by exploring the crypt. With a mix of excitement and apprehension, we pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and musty, the smell of decay and mildew almost overwhelming. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of niches holding urns and coffins. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes depicting scenes of mourning and sorrow. At the far end of the crypt was a large stone sarcophagus, its lid slightly ajar. Jenna set up the camera and voice recorder, while the rest of us tried to get comfortable in the cold, damp space. She began asking questions, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Is anyone here with us? Can you give us a sign?" For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as we were beginning to think the night would be uneventful, we heard it. A faint, scratching sound coming from inside the sarcophagus. We exchanged nervous glances, the bravado we had felt earlier quickly fading. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. We all nodded, our eyes fixed on the sarcophagus. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer, my flashlight beam steady on the stone lid. "Should we open it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jenna nodded, and together we pushed the heavy lid further open. The smell of rot and decay intensified, making us gag. Inside, there was nothing but a mummified corpse, its features twisted in an eternal grimace of agony. But the scratching sound continued, coming from beneath the corpse. "There's something under it," Jenna said, her voice barely more than a whisper. With trembling hands, we lifted the corpse out of the sarcophagus, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface covered in strange symbols. The scratching was coming from inside the box. "Open it," Jenna urged. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. The scratching stopped the moment the lid was lifted. Jenna picked up the journal and began to read aloud. It was written by a man named Jonathan Blackwood, the original owner of the crypt. He wrote about his experiments with the occult, about how he had tried to summon something from beyond the grave. He described a ritual that involved trapping a spirit inside a physical object, a box in this case. The journal ended abruptly with a final chilling entry. "I have succeeded. The spirit is trapped, but it is angry. It wants revenge." A cold chill ran down my spine as Jenna finished reading. The air in the crypt grew even colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Suddenly, the scratching started again, louder and more frantic. This time, it was coming from the walls, the floor, all around us. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely steady. We grabbed our equipment and fled the crypt, the scratching following us. As we stepped outside, the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. The moonlight cast long shadows, and I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness. We didn't stop until we were back at our base near the crypt entrance. The scratching had stopped, but the sense of being watched remained. Jenna set the journal aside and suggested we continue our investigation, but none of us had the stomach for it anymore. The fear was too real, too palpable. Then, the whispering started. At first, it was just a faint murmur, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and unintelligible. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Jenna turned on the voice recorder and held it out, her hand shaking. "If there's anyone here, please speak to us," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just darkness and shadows. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jenna nodded, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now." We gathered our equipment and hurried back to the entrance, the sense of dread growing with every step. As we reached the gates, I glanced back and saw it, a dark figure standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It watched us silently, its presence radiating pure evil. We ran the rest of the way to the car, our hearts pounding in our chests. Once inside, we locked the doors and drove away as fast as we could. The experience had shaken us to our core, and we didn't speak a word until we were miles away from the cemetery. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing the scratching sound, faint and distant, like it was coming from inside the walls. I barely slept, haunted by the memory of that dark figure and the malevolent energy that had surrounded us. The next day, Jenna called me. She sounded shaken, her usual bravado gone. "I listened to the recording," she said. "There was something there, a voice." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did it say?" There was a long pause before she answered. It said, "I am coming for you." We never went back to Evergreen Cemetery. The experience left us all with a deep-seated fear of the supernatural, a fear that I can't shake off. Even now, years later, I still feel like I'm being watched, like there's something lurking just out of sight, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the scratching,